Welcome to Old Testament History, Chapter 4, Session 8. As we proceed further into the split kingdom, we're going to see two narratives develop. In the south is the kingdom of Judah, which actually was comprised of Judah and Benjamin, as well as the bulk of the priests and Levites, many of which were expelled out of the northern kingdom, plus many faithful believers from the northern tribes who would not stand for Jeroboam's counterfeit religion. Remember how he had set that up. So they left town and moved south. So Jerusalem was the capital city, and that's where the royal palace and the temple were located. And those two functioned as centers of political and spiritual power for the nation. And the southern kingdom waxed and waned as its kings did either right or evil in the sight of the Lord, but it never regained the glory of David and Solomon. But even though that was the case, it still persevered as the light of the Jews. And the southern kingdom's greatest spiritual assignment, whether they realized it or not, was to persist until the Messiah would come. Then, on the other hand, there was the northern kingdom of Israel. And unlike the south, with its roller coaster ride of ups and downs when the kings did right or evil, this kingdom was screaming downhill straight towards oblivion. The destructive institutions began by Jeroboam in his effort to divorce his kingdom from the south, caused the nation to fall more and more into the hands of the adversary until they were ultimately crushed and devoured by the meanest nation in ancient history, the Assyrians. Of course, there were some times, like Ren said, how the southern kingdom intervened, and there were a few gasps of light in the northern kingdom, but basically it was downhill. Israel's capital city was Samaria, which 1 Kings 16:24 says that Omri, the father of Ahab, built. Its false religion featured two temples at Dan and Bethel, which were at either end of the kingdom, and Jeroboam made priests of the lowest of the people for those, because no one else dared to take that job. And so you had the two kingdoms, the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom, and they vied for control of the hearts and lives of the people through the political and religious means for the rest of the time. But the real battle was still the spiritual conflict that raged beneath the surface, and it was centered at those nexuses of royal and theological power. However, there was one more entity, there was one remaining bastion of faith, which exerted its influence over and was not controlled by, and indeed stood above, both of the other arenas. And this bastion was the prophets. It is these heroes of the faith that I'm going to extol. God didn't bring me back from the brink of death with COVID to preach the same old, so fasten your seatbelts. First, I want to nail down some facts about genuine prophets, because before there were kings, there were judges. Before judges, there was Joshua and his mentor, Moses. Moses was the greatest prophet of them all. The prophets spoke for God. What they declared happened. So because of that, who was actually in charge? Ren says spiritual matters were superior to kings. So who was in charge? Despite all the sometimes hot air from the other two, those who had effects over them both were the prophets. So they had the real power. And these prophets herded the Jews to their destiny all the way until the time of Malachi, when they were murdered by the Pharisees and replaced by the sages. And it was those inferior Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes that John the Baptist and Jesus contended with to establish the basis for a new kingdom that's going to last forever. So, the word prophet in Hebrew is Navi, N-A-V-I, or Nun, Beth, Yod, Aleph. Now the Baith is a B, but when it does not have the dot in the middle of the B, the Baith, it's pronounced with a V sound. It's aspirated. So, Navit. It's a noun, Strong's number 5030. And it means spokesman or speaker or prophet. Now, here arises a typical complication with Hebrew. Because are we speaking modern Hebrew or biblical classical Hebrew? When I give you words and spellings and pronunciations, I am giving you classical biblical Hebrew ones. Hebrew is the only dead language that's been revived into a spoken language again. It stopped being spoken about the 4th century AD and was not revived as a spoken language among the common people until the 19th century. In between, it was just read in synagogues and universities. And during that time, the proper pronunciations for Hebrew were lost. In modern Hebrew spelling, the common method does not use the dots in the middle of letters. Those dots are called a dagesh, D-A-G-E-S-H. Back in Bible college in Hebrew class, a long time ago in a galaxy far away, I learned about something called the Bagad Kafat. That's a mnemonic to remember what Hebrew letters have aspirations. You have the consonant itself, and then you have the aspirated version of it. So the Baith can be B or V. The Gimel, the G, can be G or GH. The Dalet or D can be D or DH. The Kaf can be K or KH. The Pei can be P or PH. And the Tav can be T or TH. So you remember that by Bagad Kafat. B-G-D-K-P-T. But since modern Hebrew has left out the dot, some reference books transliterate prophet as Nabi, N-A-B-I, and some reference books transliterate it as N-A-V-I. So when we cite Hebrew information, we need to take our time and double-check stuff and be prepared for people to argue with you about pronunciation. And in Hebrew, the fact that some say potato and some say potato is very true. And then people even object when you put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. So I'm sorry if I pronounce Hebrew like a goy, but it is what it is. Also, the Hebrews changed horses in midstream when it came to prophet. There was an older word for prophet, roeh, or seer, one who sees. That's Strong's number 7203. And also, choseh, or perceiver, one who perceives. Strong's number 2374. The root word of prophet, navi, is a verb. Strong's number 5042. Pronounced nava. Nun, Baith, without the dot in the middle, and ayin, nava. That means to bubble up, to boil, to pour forth, usually of pouring forth in inspired speech. Now, the last letter of nava is ayin, and that's a guttural letter. Don't ask me to pronounce it. But if you try to say it too many times in a row, you might burp. But Gesenius, in his lexicon, says that the ayin was softened into an aleph in Nava, and so it's spelled Nun, Baith, Aleph. And that's Strong's number 5012. And that's also a verb, and it means to cause to bubble up, to pour forth, to speak with divine power, to speak being moved by God, or announce, to prophesy. And of the counterfeit, to speak in an ecstatic state or pretend to be inspired as speaking in a trance. The first use of Navi, prophet, is in Genesis 20, verse 7, and it's speaking of Abraham. Genesis chapter 20, verse 6, we'll get a running start. Genesis 20, verse 6, and God said unto him in a dream, Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of your heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me, therefore I suffered thee not to touch her. This is speaking of Sarah. Verse 7, Now therefore restore the man, Abraham, his wife, for he is a prophet. First use. And he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, know that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. So, that's the first use of the word prophet. And we note the power of the prophet's words and prayers here, because they hold life or death, or blessing or judgment. So, prophets deserve respect. The second use of prophet is used of Aaron, Moses' spokesman, in Exodus chapter 7, verse 1. Take a look there. Exodus chapter 7, verse 1. And the Lord said to Moses, See, I have made thee a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron thy brother shall be thy spokesman, prophet. Thou shalt speak all that I command thee, and Aaron thy brother shall speak unto Pharaoh, that he send the children of Israel out of his land. Now, there is more to that than meets the eye. Why was that necessary? Well, we need to ask Moses that, and he explains in Exodus chapter 4, verse 10. Exodus chapter 4, verse 10. Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. And the Lord said to him, Well, who's made man's mouth? Or who makes the dumb or deaf or the seeing or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I'll be with your mouth, and I'll teach you what you shall say. And Moses said, Oh, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send. In other words, please send somebody else. Verse 14, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, Is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know he can speak well. And also, behold, he comes forth to meet thee, and when he sees these, he will be glad in his heart. And thou shalt speak unto him, and put words in his mouth, and I will be with thy mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. Verse 16, and he shall be thy spokesman, speaker, unto the people, and he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to him instead of God. Now, this brings out a facet of prophecy that some don't connect. Moses said he was not eloquent. He was slow of speech. Well, wouldn't you also be if you hadn't spoken Hebrew in 40 years? Because Moses had escaped to Midian, and they didn't speak Hebrew there. They spoke a Semitic language, which many scholars believe was Aramaic. Hebrew and Aramaic are related, but they're not exactly alike. So this is how it worked. God spoke to Moses. Moses understood what God said. Then Moses spoke to Aaron. And Aaron rephrased what Moses said into eloquent Hebrew. So this demonstrates how a genuine prophet operates. Because God does not possess their mouth and make the prophet speak like a robot. God does not show off like that with trances and such. God shows the prophet a vision. The prophet is a seer. Or God gives the prophet revelation. The prophet is a perceiver. Then the prophet puts what they see or perceive into their own words, just like Aaron did for Moses. There he got it. Now, I'm going to talk to you about prophets. I'm going to bring forth excerpts from several of my classes, Growing in God's Power, Energized Ministries in the Body of Christ, and the One Spirit of Original Christianity. Because of the many who have functioned as false prophets, the genuine ministry of a prophet has to be clarified. We need prophets today, and some of you, believers, who hear this teaching or the recording are prophets. Well, hello. The church needs you to stand up. Most people think that prophets are those who mainly foretell the future. That actually is the main avenue that the false ones use today to gain control over people. It actually is a minor facet of a prophet's ministry. Many genuine prophets may only foretell little. The prophet's main functions are to speak for God, to protect God's people, to encourage them, call them back when they're out of fellowship, and pronounce judgment. The future stuff comes when it comes. My interaction with those who I know are genuine prophets is that they are disciplined and determined, and they don't compromise on the word. So, do you want to be a prophet? Listen up. This office is very versatile, and consequently, there are many kinds of prophets, lesser and greater, supporting ones and ruling ones, and the jurisdictions of their powers range from the courts of the temple to the royal courts of the kingdoms of both Jew and Gentile. They were the tip of God's spear in the Old Testament. But to understand them now in this Old Testament class, we must understand how God's Spirit worked in them back then. Because there are 7 characteristics of the Spirit of God which He has given to humans, and these vary dispensationally. We're familiar with the defining passage regarding the Spirit in the New Testament, which is 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, especially of the manifestations of the Spirit in chapter 12, verses 8 through 10. Well, there is a corresponding passage in Isaiah, which does the same for what was available back then in the Old Testament dispensation. And it lists the 7 manifestations of the Spirit that were available back then. Please turn to Isaiah 11. Isaiah 11. We'll begin in verse 1. And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. The key to understanding this in Isaiah 11 is to recognize the coupled terms and how they relate to each other. Now, the Spirit of the Lord stands alone, and then it's followed by 3 pairs or couplets, A and B, C and D, E and F. They couple adeptnesses in the physical realm with their spiritual counterparts. So, in other words, the manifestations of word of wisdom and word of knowledge, which are terms A and E in that set of 6, they deal with information regarding things in the physical realm. Word of knowledge, word of wisdom. We've been taught in advanced classes, taught in various ministries, that the manifestation of discerning of spirits covers the same, word of knowledge, word of wisdom, but it covers the same for the spiritual realm. So that's the clue regarding the B term, that the spirit of understanding is something in the spiritual category. And when you do a word study on it, you'll see that's indeed what it is. The spirit of understanding is equivalent to the negative side of discerning of spirits. Now, some may think that there's not a lot on the manifestation of discerning of spirits in the Old Testament, but actually, the book of Job is the greatest treatise on discerning of spirits in the whole Bible. The subject then was fully exposed when Jesus made a, quote, show of them openly, principalities and powers, in Colossians 2:15. Consequently, I believe that in that list of those 6, that the terms the B and the F, the spirit of understanding and the spirit of the reverence of the Lord, both correspond to aspects in the spiritual realm. All right? And that's discerning of spirits, negative and positive. So, this physical and spiritual coupling sheds light on the middle terms that we have to discuss, terms C and D, the spirit of counsel and the spirit of might. Counsel would then be concerning the physical realm, because might is definitely in the spiritual realm. So dealing with the depthnesses and the power manifestations of healing and miracles. So now we're ready to concentrate on the group of Old Testament manifestations which the prophets majored in. Because remember, one of the dispensational differences between the Spirit in the New Testament and the Spirit in the Old Testament is that today we have all of it, all that's available. But in the Old Testament, folks only had portions, not the whole thing. Like Elisha had a double portion of what was on Elijah. That's a difference between the Spirit available back then in that dispensation and the Spirit that's available now. All right? So consequently, because there were differences in the quantity, some prophets were ruling prophets and some were supportive. The ruling prophets had more in the Spirit of the Lord category, which we know from word studies means spiritual depthness in leadership. That's Spirit of the Lord. These prophets were the senior prophets that oversaw the schools of the prophets. Their jurisdiction also involved routinely advising kings and or high priests. The other major categories for prophets were in the manifestation of the spirit of knowledge and the spirit of wisdom and the spirit of counsel. Now, we know a lot about the first two, word of knowledge, word of wisdom. But what is the spirit of counsel? I'm going to give you a diagram in the PDF handout of all these different manifestations, the 7 manifestations in the Old Testament. But I'm not proposing that we change labels with what we've been taught, because we've been taught about the New Testament stuff, and these are Old Testament labels for the manifestations and the ministries that were available back then. So we just need to keep those in that context. But in the diagram, I show how the physical is on the left and the spiritual is on the right. So the spirit of counsel, the Hebrew word translated counsel, here in Isaiah 11, is etzah, Strong's number 6098, which means advice. It comes from the verb yagatz, number 3289. That word is found in Isaiah 9:6, where it speaks of the Messiah as being marvel of a counselor, yagatz, because he was the greatest prophet of all. In ancient times, it was a highly esteemed office to be an assistant or counselor or advisor to a ruler. Many believers functioned in this way, beginning with Joseph and many more prophets, including Samuel, Daniel, Nehemiah, Mordecai. It was one of God's musterings at the centers of power in a physical way to match the spiritual and angelic ways that were there too. Both the noun and the verb for counsel are used very often in this way as an advisor to a ruler. The first use of the verb is in Exodus 18:19. where the father-in-law of Moses gave him advice, gave him counsel. So let's take a look at that. Exodus 18, verse 17 through 20. Verse 17, and Moses' father-in-law said unto him, the thing that you do is not good. He was standing and waiting. The people were waiting in line all day to talk to him. Thou shalt surely wear away, both thou and this people that is with thee, for this thing's too heavy for you. Thou art not able to perform it yourself alone. Hearken now to my voice, and I will give thee etzah, counsel, advice. And God shall be with thee. Be thou for the people to Godward, that thou mayest bring the causes unto God. And thou shalt teach them ordinances and laws. Thou shalt show them the way wherein they must walk, and the work they must do. So, that's the first use. I believe that the reason that the quote-unquote spirit of counsel is given stature in this spirit of list as a full manifestation of the spirit of counsel. The reason that that is the case, I think, is a consequence of not all believers having the Spirit in the Old Testament. See, in the New Testament, we get born again. What gets born? Spirit. So every born-again believer has the Spirit. But in the Old Testament, when you were a believer, you did not automatically get the Spirit. Okay? Those believers had to go to someone who had the Spirit for their connection to God, to get spiritual advice. So, we can adapt this understanding in our New Testament spiritual scenario, because today, all the believers have the Spirit, so I believe the role of a prophet is a bit different, because they're not the only ones around that have the Spirit. I think it's an important nuance that believers who think they are prophets need to understand, because I believe that the God told me to tell you syndrome is a hallmark of an improperly trained prophet. New Testament one. Why? Because God's big enough to tell believers first, because they have the Spirit. Now, if they don't recognize it, or if they don't obey, they may be hearing from heaven another way. Consequently, one of the most important roles of a New Testament prophet or counselor, I believe, is to get people to recognize what God's already been trying to tell them. If prophets don't get this right, they tend to become busybodies telling people what to do all the time. Plus, if that was really from God, why do many of these prophets' so-called prophecies disagree with one another? You ever think about that? Well, that causes some people to, quote-unquote, shop counselors until they get somebody willing to say what they want to hear, instead of what God's been telling them to do all along. But that's the difference between the New Testament and the Old. We're going to the Old right now to lay the foundation for what a prophet really is. All right? So, 2 Kings contains a verse where counsel and might occur together. The counsel is the revelation. The might that goes with it is the miracle required to bring it to pass. So, prophets in the Old Testament were also the miracle workers. When carried out properly, this ministry of the Spirit of counsel is spectacular. In other words, here's an example of it, where in 2 Kings, counsel and might are used together. It was with Isaiah. There was a spokesman for the Assyrian army that was challenging Hezekiah, and he twisted the words of Isaiah the prophet, saying that their confidence in God was misplaced. Well, little did he know the power of Isaiah's words, just like the first usage showed. A short time later, the world changed because of Isaiah's words, because most of the dreaded Assyrian army was dead because a plague hit, and it put the whole nation of Assyria in decline, and soon afterwards it was assimilated by Babylon. One prayer changed the world. So we don't mess around with when God's counsel and might are in operation. Take a look at it here in 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 19 and 20. 2 Kings 18:19. And Rabshakeh said unto them, Speak ye now to Hezekiah, Thus saith the great king, the king of Assyria. What confidence is this, wherein thou trustest? You say, but they are vain words. I have counsel, Ch, advice, and strength, might for the war. Well, where'd those things come from? They came from Isaiah. Now on whom dost thou trust, that thou rebellest against me? So he called the counsel and might of Isaiah vain words. Big mistake. The book of Jeremiah contains the only other place where counsel and might occur together. And this opens up more details concerning this. Jeremiah 32:19. Jeremiah 32:19. Great in counsel, Ch, advice, and mighty in work. For thine eyes are open upon all the ways of the sons of men, to give everyone according to his ways, and according to the fruit of his doings. So, why is God great in counsel and might? It says, because his eyes are opened upon all the ways of the sons of men. All right? Psalm 103 declares that God knows our frame. In other words, God knows what makes us tick and what ticks us off. God revealed that to the counselors of old who advised countries and kings. Therefore, the association of this long suit, the spirit of counsel, with the ways of the sons of men in Jeremiah, also it's associated with the thoughts of men in Proverbs, that is significant. Because God sees through all the smoke screens and deviations and cleverness of men to chart a proper course to his destination, his solution. Therefore, prophets can't be dummies when it comes to human behavior. They can't be naive. Because of the trust believers put in prophets, God holds them accountable. They must be faithful. They must speak what God wants spoken, because prophets can exercise such great influence over God's people. The word of the Lord describes strict criteria for those who claim to be seers and spiritual advisors. Look at Deuteronomy 13. Deuteronomy 13, verse 1. If there arise among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and gives thee a sign or a wonder, so there's the might part, and the sign or the wonder come to pass, wherefore he spake unto thee, saying, Let us go after other gods, which thou hast not known, and let us serve them, thou shalt not hearken unto the words of that prophet, or that dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God proves you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall walk after the Lord your God and reverence him, and keep his commandments and obey his voice, and you shall serve him and cleave unto him. And that prophet, or that dreamer of dreams, shall be put to death, because he has spoken to turn you away from the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, and redeemed you out of the house of bondage, to thrust thee out of the way which the Lord thy God commanded thee to walk in. So shalt thou put evil away from the midst of thee. Wow. That's a biggie. So, if any prophet does that today, run. There's another important passage. Deuteronomy 18, verse 15. The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me, Moses said. Unto him shall you hearken, according to all that thou desirest of the Lord thy God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, neither let me see this great fire any more, that I die not. That's referring to when they heard the voice of God recite the 10 Commandments from the top of Mount Horeb, and it scared the heck out of them. Verse 17, And the Lord said to me, They have well spoken that which they have spoken. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto thee, and I will put my words in his mouth. This is a messianic prophecy. And he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. And it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hearken to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. But the prophet which shall presume to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or that shall speak in the name of other gods, even that prophet shall die. And if thou shalt say in thine heart, How shall we know the word which the Lord hath not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing follow not, nor come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord hath not spoken. Very simple. But the prophet hath spoken it presumptuously, thou shalt not revere him. So, if anyone claiming to be a prophet foretells something, and it does not come to pass, they are disqualified. No excuses, period. We no longer should hold them and their words in respect. Now, that would put them out of business, wouldn't it? Surely would end all this craziness that's done in the name of the Lord today. If it does not happen as predicted, they're fired. The book of Ezekiel contains a very clear description of false prophets, and then the inverse describes the genuine. Ezekiel 13, verse 1. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the prophets of Israel that prophesy, and say thou unto them that prophesy out of their own hearts, Hear ye the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord God, Woe unto the foolish prophets that follow their own spirit, and have seen nothing. O Israel, thy prophets are like jackals in the desert. Well, jackals are pack animals. They hunt in packs. Those who succumb to bad advice and believe it are seldom left alone, and they're hounded and assailed repeatedly. Like when the 1-900-YO stupid psychic hotlines get somebody to follow their advice, they don't quit. They try to extract more and more money from those who follow, and even threaten them with destruction if they start to get cold feet and try to pull away. Ezekiel 13, verse 5. You have not gone up into the gaps, neither made up the hedge for the house of Israel to stand in the battle in the day of the Lord. Prophets are supposed to encourage God's people to do what the Word says. They are to protect them, not prey upon them. When the believer's protection is breached, the prophet is supposed to bravely stand in the gap to protect. They're supposed to define the borders of that which is proper behavior. That is what it's meant to make up the hedge. This hedge is what is referred to as a hedge of protection, and they are to align with it physically to show the boundaries of that hedge spiritually. Verse 6, they have seen, the false prophets have seen vanity and lying divination, saying, The Lord saith, and the Lord hath not sent them. They have made others to hope that they would confirm the word. Have you not seen a vain vision? Have you not spoken a lying divination? Whereas you say, The Lord said it, albeit I have not spoken it. Therefore thus saith the Lord God, because you have spoken vanity and seen lies, therefore I am against you, those prophets, said the Lord God. And mine hand shall be upon the prophets that see vanity and that divine lies. They shall not be in the assembly of my people, neither shall they be written in the writing of the house of the Lord. Wow. Neither shall they enter into the land of Israel. And you shall know that I am the Lord God. So, woe to the prophet that does not speak for God. Woe to them that misguide God's people, who get them to follow vanity. Ezekiel portrayed another analogy to provide protection with the parable of the poorly built wall. City walls were built to protect the inhabitants. They're supposed to be the best workmanship so that it'll provide protection. But the false prophets acted like they were building the walls, that is, defining and reinforcing proper behavior, but they actually were doing shoddy construction. They prophesied that there would be peace when there was none, because one cannot have peace when they're violating the word. But they coated their walls with whitewash that looked oh so good, but it was poor for mortar. This concept ties in with Deuteronomy 29, that study on opium and wormwood that's related to false teaching. If God's people are caused to stray from proper doctrine and practice by intoxicating or alluring or impractical teaching, if we do this, the word will move like it's never moved before, etc., they will not have peace. But those who teach the imaginations of their heart and people want to hear stuff instead of what God really says, they'll try to convince the people that they still have peace when they don't. Ezekiel 13, verse 10. Because they have seduced my people, saying peace, and there was no peace. And one built up a wall, and lo, others daubed it with untempered mortar, with whitewash. It looks good, but it's not very strong. Say unto them which daub it with whitewash, that it shall fall, and there shall be an overflowing shower, and ye, O great hailstones, shall fall, and a stormy wind shall rend it. Lo, when the wall is fallen, shall it not be said unto you, where is the daubing wherewith you have daubed it? Therefore thus saith the Lord God, I will even rend it with a stormy wind in my fury, and there shall be an overflowing shower in mine anger, and great hailstones in my fury to consume it. So will I break down the wall that you have daubed with whitewash, and bring it down to the ground, so that the foundation thereof shall be discovered, and it shall fall, and you shall be consumed in the midst thereof, and you shall know that I am the Lord. Thus will I accomplish my wrath upon the wall, and upon them that have daubed it with whitewash, and I will say unto you, the wall is no more, and neither they who daubed it. The prophets of Israel which prophesy concerning Jerusalem, and which see visions of peace for her, there is no peace, saith the Lord. So, the prophet is charged with warning and protecting God's people. Therefore, they must be vigilant and faithful, for in God's eyes, they are held accountable. So, you still want to be a prophet? The rewards are great, but so is the responsibility. Ezekiel chapter 3, verse 17. Son of man, I have made thee a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore hear the word at my mouth, and give them warning from me. When I say unto the wicked, thou shalt surely die, and thou givest him not warning, nor speakest to warn the wicked from his wicked way to save his life, the same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at thy hand. Yet, if you warn the wicked, and he turn not from his wickedness, nor from his wicked way, he shall die in his iniquity, but thou hast delivered thy soul. Again, when the righteous man doth turn from his righteousness and commit iniquity, and I lay a stumbling block before him, he shall die, because thou hast not given him warning. He shall die in his sin. And his righteousness which he hath done shall not be remembered, but his blood will I require at thine hand. Nevertheless, if thou warn the righteous man, that the righteous sin not, and he doth not sin, he shall surely live, because he's warned, and also thou hast delivered thy soul. This describes the responsibility that God charges prophets with. These were the faithful guides who grappled with the rudders of state in both the kingdoms, north and south. So now, I'm going to give you a who's who of the prophets who guided the kingdoms, beginning with Samuel. He's the one that laid out the pattern for how the kingdom was to be run, and who anointed the first two kings, Saul and David. Samuel also superintended a guild of prophets. Those who loved God and believed they had a calling to be prophets were trained. This actually began with Abraham and had carried through since. Genesis chapter 14, verse 14. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. The paper, The School of the Prophets, said that the word trained there in Genesis 14:14 in Aramaic means academy. Every senior prophet since Abraham has trained gifted people to succeed them. Those who felt God's calling on them were attracted to functioning prophets to learn at their feet, work with them, promote and prolong their ministries. So consequently, Samuel had followers. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 10. 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 5. He's speaking to Saul. After thou shalt come to the hill of God, where is the garrison of the Philistines, and it shall come to pass that when thou art come thither to the city, that thou shalt meet a company of prophets coming down from the high place with the psaltery, a tabret, a pipe, and a harp before them, and they shall prophesy. Now, the word company, the company of prophets, is very interesting. It is Strong's number 2256. And the basic meaning of that word is rope. They used a rope as a measuring cord. Hence, that rope was a measured portion, an allotment. So this was an allotment of prophets. It was a portion of prophets from a greater group. So they were the ones assigned to this site. Okay? Therefore, this implies that Samuel's school of the prophets was not a small organization. I believe there were hundreds of them. 1 Samuel 19, verse 20, is another occurrence of it. 1 Samuel 19:20. And Saul sent messengers to take David, and when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing as appointed over them, the Spirit of God was upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. So this location in 1 Samuel 19 is Samuel's home in Ramah. That logically would be a place for another company, allotment, or group of prophets. Other sites for groups of prophets were Jericho in 2 Kings 2:5, Gilgal in 2 Kings 4:38, Bethel, 2 Kings 2:3. Other groups of prophets were referred to in 1 Kings 18:4, 2 Kings 4:1, 2 Kings 23:2. So from this, I think we can see that Samuel was carrying on in Abraham's steps. Now, we don't have proof, but I think it's probable that the distinguished prophets mentioned by name in the Who's Who in Kings and Chronicles came from these schools. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 2. The king, David, said unto Nathan the prophet, See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells within curtains. So Nathan the prophet was David's advisor. You know, these guys were the real thing too. They were fearless. That's how they got their names in the book, because this prophet Nathan had to confront King David when he had messed up. And remember, King David was a prophet too. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 25. And he sent by the hand of Nathan the prophet, and he called Solomon's name Jedaiah because of the Lord. So Solomon was a prophet too that Nathan interacted with. 2 Samuel 15:27. The king said also unto Zadok the priest, Art thou not a seer? Return unto the city in peace, and your 2 sons with you, Ahimaaz thy son, and Jonathan the son of Abiathar. So Zadok was a seer. He was a priest in the line of Aaron, but he also was a prophet. So he would have been trained at Jerusalem amongst the priests and the Levites. This was another school centered in Jerusalem. 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 10. 2 Samuel 24:10. And David's heart smote him after that he had numbered the people. And David said unto the Lord, I have sinned greatly in that I have done, and now I beseech thee, O Lord, take away the iniquity of thy servant, for I have done very foolishly. For when David was up in the morning, the word of the Lord came unto the prophet Gad, David's seer. So Gad was another prophet that advised the king. All right. 1 Chronicles 25:5. 1 Chronicles 25:5. All these were the sons of Heman, the king's seer, in the words of God, to lift up the horn. And God gave Heman 14 sons and 3 daughters. All these were under the hands of their father for song in the house of the Lord, with cymbals, psalteries, and harps, for the service of the house of God, according to the king's order to Asaph, Jeduthun, and Heman. So, Heman was overseeing another group of musicians. He was called their father for song. He was the king's seer in the words of God to lift up the horn. So, lifting up the horn, that's music. The words of God. He was in charge of the musicians that played the Psalms of David. All right? So this is another group. Music was very powerful. It's a vehicle to attune and build God's people to do what they ought to do. But it's equally able to destroy. Hence, there must be trained and disciplined musician prophets. It is said of musicians that they prophesy with a harp. All right? 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 8. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 8. But Zadok the priest, and Benaniah the son of Jehoiada, and Nathan the prophet, and Shimei and Ray, and the mighty men which belonged to David, were not with Adonijah. Remember, we covered this when Adonijah wanted to be king, but God had said, it shall be Solomon. And these men, Zadok and Benaniah and Nathan, etc., bravely sided with Solomon. But they knew that if Adonijah succeeded in the throne, they'd probably be murdered. So it took guts to do what they did. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 34. And they were told, let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet, Zadok was a seer too, remember, and Nathan the prophet, anoint Solomon king over Israel. First Chronicles 29:29. First Chronicles 29:29. Now the acts of David the king, first and last, behold, they are written in the book of Samuel the seer, and in the book of Nathan the prophet, and in the book of Gad the seer. So, some prophets wrote, some just spoke. But these wrote books. The excerpts of these books, I believe, are in Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Look at 1 Kings 11:29. Here's another in the who's who of prophets in the split kingdom. 1 Kings 11:29. It came to pass at the time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem that the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite found him in the way, and then he tore his garment into 12 pieces. Now let's go. We're going to finish up here in 1 Kings chapter 13. 1 Kings chapter 13, verse 1. And behold, there came a man of God out of Judah by the word of the Lord unto Bethel, and Jeroboam stood by the altar to burn incense. We covered this last week, I think. And he cried against the altar in the word of the Lord and said, O altar, altar, thus saith the Lord, behold, a child should be born of the house of David, Josiah by name, and upon thee shall he offer the priests of the high places that burn incense upon thee, and men's bones shall be burned upon thee. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, This is the sign which the Lord hath spoken. Behold, the altar shall be rent, and the ashes that are upon it shall be poured out. Remember, I covered that in the last session. Here it calls him a man of God. Why don't we know his name? The rest of the account says why. Verse 7. Remember, in between, Jeroboam stretched out his hand and said, Get that man. And Jeroboam's hand withered. And then he said to the man of God, Can you pray for me? And he did. And his hand was healed. So after that, in chapter 13, verse 7, to this same prophet, and the king, Jeroboam, said unto the man of God, still doesn't name him, Come home with me and refresh yourself, and I will give you a reward. You know, red flag, bribe alert, bribe alert. And the man of God said to the king, If you would give me half your house, I will not go in with you, neither will I eat bread or drink water in this place. Why? Well, he had just spoken a word against Jeroboam's religion and against the temples that he had built and the altar that he had built. Do you think Jeroboam wanted to be friends with him or poison him? I think he was hated, and Jeroboam would have tried to poison him. God told him, You don't eat bread or drink water at all. You come around, you go back a different way than what you came. Verse 9, For thou hast charged me by the word of the Lord, saying, Eat no bread, nor drink, nor water, nor turn again by the same way which thou camest. So he went another way and returned not by the way that he came to Bethel. You know why, I think? Because there were liars in wait to arrest him if he had gone back the same way he came. See, this is big league stuff. That prophet was hated because he ruined the dedication of Jeroboam's idolatry. And his prophecy hung over it for hundreds of years till it happened. That men's bones were going to be burnt on the altar, and even the name of the guy that would do it. So I believe there were assassins hunting him down. So don't return by the same way you came. But look at verse 11. Chapter 13, verse 11. Now there dwelt an old prophet in Bethel, and his sons came and told him all the works that the man of God had done that day in Bethel, and the words which he had spoken unto the king. Them they told also to their father. Well, wait a minute. There was a prophet there. Well, why didn't this guy stand up to Jeroboam? Why did God have to send a guy in from out of town to do it? You know why? Because this guy didn't have the guts. Verse 12. And their father said to them, well, which way did he go? And his sons had said, the way the man of God went that came from Judah. He said to his son, saddle the ass. So they saddled him the ass, and he rode thereon. And he went after the man of God and found him under an oak, and said to him, are you the man of God that came from Judah? And he said, yep, I am. He was sitting there under the oak. Well, he had just stood up the king. He had just prophesied the future. He even named the name. And then the altar had cracked, just like he said. And Jeroboam's arm had withered. Counsel and might. And he had believed to heal it. Well, wouldn't you have stopped to process all that when you'd finally gotten out safe? Well, why don't we know who that prophet is? What else could that prophet have done if he started out like that? I mean, he could have been as famous as Elijah or Elisha. But we'll never know, because he let his guard down. And the adversary worked against him through a copped-out prophet to defeat him. Look what happened. Verse 15. And then this copped-out prophet said to the guy who was sitting under the tree, come home with me and eat bread. And he said, I may not return with you, nor go in with you, neither will I eat bread or drink water with you in this place. For it was said to me by the word of the Lord, thou shalt not eat no bread nor drink water there, nor turn again to go by the way that you came. Verse 18. And he said to him, I am a prophet, also as thou art. Yeah, right. And an angel spake unto me by the word of the Lord, saying, bring him back with thee into thine house, that he may eat bread and drink water. But he lied unto him. Why did he do that? The adversary was using that copped-out prophet, because the adversary sure hated the good prophet for what he had done. Verse 19. So he went back with him, and he did eat bread in his house and drink water. And it came to pass, that they sat at the table, that the word of the Lord came into that old copped-out prophet that brought him back. You know, remember the seesaw battle that I've talked about that happens when people fall? They don't fall all at once. They have good days, they have bad days. It's a seesaw battle that happens with genuine men of God when they fall. Well, here it is in print. One moment they're crooked, and the next moment they're straight. Like Balaam, another example. Verse 21. And he cried unto the man of God that came from Judah, saying, thus saith the Lord, forasmuch as thou hast disobeyed the mouth of the Lord, and hast not kept back the commandment which the Lord thy God commanded thee, but came back and hast eaten bread and drunk water in place of which the Lord did say to thee, eat no bread and drink no water, your carcass shall not come into the sepulchre of your fathers. Folks, that's why we don't know his name. So, if you're a prophet, just do what God says. Do what God says. Don't let anyone talk you out of it. And if you carry it out, God will move heaven and earth to protect you. You'll be safe. So, tonight I'm calling all prophets. I'm calling all prophets. You first responders to spiritual emergencies. You who bravely come running toward danger instead of running away. The times are dire. God needs you. The church needs you. So it's time to take off the training wheels. It's time to step up. It's time to step forward. It's time to stand. And it's time to speak. Folks, this is part 1. There's more to follow. Bless you. That's it.